Anyway, welcome back, everyone. And our next speaker is Dr. Ron Kennedy Bailey, who serves as the Assistant Dean of Clinical Education at the Charles R. Drew University, SOM and Chief Medical Officer of Kindred Health Systems, Inc. Dr. Bailey's career has been centered on quality clinical care, forensic medical legal evaluations, patient advocacy, and community outreach. He's served in many APA leadership positions. He has been a voting member of the APA Board of Trustees since 2019. And throughout his career, Dr. Bailey has worked with underserved and minority populations. He has over 60 peer-reviewed publications that address psychiatric care, health disparities, and forensic practice, including the books, A Doctor's Prescription for Healthcare Reform and At Gunpoint. So, Terry, I believe we have some pre-polling exam questions.
We do. Thank you, Dr. Fowles. I have a pre-test I'm going to launch for everyone. It's Zoom polling. You'll see 5 questions from Dr. Bailey. If you'll just scroll through and click your response on each of those questions. I think he'd really like to know at the end of the day if his talk influences your perspectives on some of these questions. So you should be seeing a poll on your screen. And if you'll click on answers, I'm not seeing anybody voting though, gentlemen. I'm seeing some votes come in. If you are at a desktop or a laptop that has a pop-up blocker, Zoom polling does appear as a pop-up. So if you're not seeing the polling or can't respond, it could be related to that feature. And we'll give you 30 more seconds. So we'll have given everybody 2 minutes to respond, and then we'll share the results and rerun this at the end as a post-test to see if the results differ. Thanks for that 2 minutes and your answers. Sharing the results, looks like the most popular response was elevated gun presence leads to increased death rates. The AMA classifies firearm violence as a public health crisis. In Arizona, homicide rates occur at a rate of 342 per 100,000. And your answer was that 780 children die from firearm injuries, and the percent of firearm violence deaths contributing to police is at 12%. So that will be interesting to compare at the end. And with that, Dr. Fowles, we will start our presentation from Dr. Bailey, who will join us live at the end of his recorded session for your Q&A. So just a reminder, chat is for conversational chat. You can open up the chat window to participate there. Click on the Q&A, the double bubble, to open up the Q&A window and offer your questions there, and they'll come to our attention more quickly. Thank you.
I'm Dr. Ron Kennedy Bailey, Assistant Dean of Clinical Education at Charles R. Drew UCLA School of Medicine here in Los Angeles, and the Chief Medical Officer at the Kedron Psychiatric Hospital in downtown LA. Very happy to have been invited by the Arizona State Psychiatric Society to present work on a book I published in 2018 on gun violence or firearm violence in America. I understand that this is an issue of great importance all over the country, and in many states like Arizona, where there can be higher rates than the national norms. I think we should look very carefully at what the empirical data shows about firearm violence and think about strategic, empirically based strategies to address it. It's very important for me as a psychiatrist, a forensic psychiatrist by training, to point out that all the things that I'm aware of in my research are key and relevant from a strategic standpoint, but we're aware that many strategies must be earmarked specifically for the local or regional area where they exist. And because of that, we will share a lot of data today, and I encourage an active dialogue today and in an ongoing fashion with your entire group to think about how psychiatry should play a role in behavioral management of firearm violence. Objectives will be to illustrate the correlation between gun ownership and elevated rates of unwarranted death, show the effects of guns on youth and adolescents, as well as adults. And there are some differences. Understand how simple firearm presence in the home can lead to increased mortality or death. And understand that firearm violence and SPMI, or patients with serious persistent mental illness like schizophrenia or severe bipolar disorder or schizoaffective disorder, are not by definition linked. A huge point, I think, for us in psychiatry. And finally, maybe to possibly highlight some interventions that can reduce the destructive effects of firearm violence. I'd also say that firearm violence in America is not a uniquely individualized event. All across the world, you see certain communities, certain societies, certain countries where the use of firearms are greatly enhanced and much more likely to be involved in violent episodes or violent actions. Clearly, the local dynamics or the culture of different countries and societies plays a large role in the institution of violence in general. But clearly, when you add firearm access and the propensity toward firearm use, some communities and societies find themselves at greater risk. At this point, America is one of those countries with higher risk and higher rates of firearm violence. America's gun culture, defined by how various individuals, but also institutions, either consciously or unconsciously interact with firearms. What are our thoughts or beliefs about firearms? Were we acculturated or trained, or did we come up as a young person with ready access to firearms? I often will say that I grew up in a southern town in Texas, with a grandfather who would take me out to his farm where he had animals and grew vegetables, and he regularly had a long rifle in the back of his truck. But he never really thought of using that for anything other than for protection, very often against animals, not in a direct engagement with other humans. So how we think and believe about guns, in addition to pure access to guns, can play a large role in identifying and promulgating America's gun culture. Behaviors as well. Some persons are much more quick to move toward a final solution, whether it's for the gun or otherwise, when there's any dynamic or interpersonal conflict. Others, probably those that we speak to as psychiatrists, have a tendency toward mediation, using the verbal response to conflict to de-escalate rather than theoretically to throw reasonably, more, energy behind the fire, so to speak. And of course, what are the cultural norms in that setting? And we kind of spoke about that. As I point out, gun violence can certainly vary because the culture varies very often between states. It's not monolithic or similar or exactly the same within and among different states. There is correlates to the variables of gun violence. The community's policies on hunting, and whether somebody can have access. I mentioned my grandfather and regularly having a long barrel shotgun in the, or long barreled hunting rifle, in the back of his truck regularly, or he wasn't always going hunting with it, but it stayed there all the time. Membership in organizations that might promote gun ownership or gun access can also play a role. And really the presence or absence thereof of firearm legislation, such as stand your ground laws or bans on assault weapons, all play a role. Many variables. That's why it's a state-by-state construct, and even some local municipalities kind of get into the role of addressing access to guns. DC many years ago had passed what was called the Heller Law, and that went over to the U.S. Supreme Court, because they've made their own law regarding access to guns. And of course, that was very different than what they saw in neighboring states or jurisdictions. Also, the density of vendors who sell weapons and the access to gun shows. So in some places, that access is much greater and increases the likelihood that legal gun purchase will occur in certain circumstances. Next depiction just kind of points out, the magnitude of the issue of the problem in our society. This comment that the U.S. as a country would argue that there's no light at the end of the tunnel may be a bit jocular and even funny for some, but not for others when we think about the overall risk. I use the term magnitude, sheer propensity of access to guns, use of guns to settle conflict. Very often to focus on domestic or interpersonal dynamic conflict between persons. Although as we discussed later today, there's a huge disconnect in many settings between who persons purchase a gun, why they purchase a gun, very often to defend themselves or their family, as compared to what actually happens very often is these guns are used very often in domestic quarrels between persons who actually know each other. Politics or public health. A huge concern, I think, in this discussion, because gun violence affects a variety of institutions in our life. Our physical health, our emotional, psychological wellness, the economy of a community, all can be impacted by gun access. And important questions may include, how does one's individual right, i.e. the Second Amendment, to own a firearm affect others in society? Others may feel more at risk in a high gun access community. Others may feel more afraid if persons have open carry, for example. Some jurisdictions where you can see someone's gun as compared to concealed carry. Or just knowing if this concealed carry is legal, then more persons in the setting may actually have a gun. There's a recent case in which somebody went to a church and attempted to act out, and many persons in the church had a gun. They responded, and that created a variety of questions. One, the ability to prevent persons walking to church with a gun. Secondly, the benefit of persons who perhaps had a gun that may have helped stop a bad event. The third, how many persons would have thought that if you're in church, that many individuals sitting next to you in church on a Sunday may actually have a gun. So huge issues to think about that clearly affect, I think, the public health concerns for all of us. So whether I have or don't have a gun does affect other persons who are around me. That leads, I think, to the discussion. It has political implications for all communities. Next, the data is very clear. This is some Siegel's work that higher gun ownership rates in general, access, clearly leads to disproportionately higher number of firearm homicides. So the data is clear that having a gun or having guns definitely does increase the likelihood, when you look at the data, that one will live in a community, in a society, where there'll be more firearm deaths. And homicides very often occur due to dynamic interpersonal violence. And since we've had in our history, not just in the US, but everywhere, the propensity of human beings to have interpersonal conflict, it raises the question substantively of whether or not one should consider a societal role in modifying, if not limiting, access to guns. The data implies that simply having access in a setting where individuals are likely to have conflict, which tends to happen in all communities, that such makes a volatile combination. This trend can be similar across developed nations, where you're seeing access to guns in some settings higher than others. We'd historically thought of these higher numbers being in so-called less developed or more agricultural societies, not those that are much more technology-based. In some settings, that's changing. Therefore, restrictions and safety measures should improve public health. And one of my take-home points has always been given this lecture to address that we certainly should, there can be a lot of debates on whether a person should have access to guns or not, and whether there should be ability to have open carry or to buy guns in settings where there's a gun show. But one thing we really shouldn't debate that should be mandatory and that we should execute as a society are increased safety trainings and ensuring that all persons have safety-related orientation with access to a gun. One of the classic struggles that we see in our society is a person may buy a gun. In our society, there tend to be three peaks: those who have no gun, those who have one gun, and the third group that actually has a large number. And that number in our society now averages about 17 or 18 guns per person in that gun enthusiast group. So we see a wide variety, I think, of the likelihood of access to guns and where we are likely to find them over time. One key point is that very often the person who purchases the gun could be the person who's going to use the gun in a homicide. Whether somebody else in your home gets the gun and uses it, or there's someone else who comes from out of the home gets it and uses it. The person buys a gun, often has it at home for their own safety, but for a variety of reasons, especially during the heat of conflict or the heat of battle, the gun is obtained very often in indiscriminate purposes, practices, by someone else, and they use the gun. Very often it may address issues of safety, or someone who may not be intended to have the gun, maybe a teenager or a young person, and they don't go to the safety training. Maybe the adult in the home who bought the gun did, but then the person who did not get the safety training has an accident. There are probably more accidental shootings than purposeful shootings with guns in our society currently. So with all that in mind, the American Medical Association kind of got involved in this construct after the APA, I'd acknowledge. The APA had language in this regard a decade before. But the American Medical Association formally classified firearm violence as a key public health crisis in 2016. A huge issue to bring the weight of our largest and most prominent medical organization behind this issue, to bring some attention to it, hopefully to bring some public energy and the type of support that's needed to align the resources, I think, essential to create some effective change. Statistics. Our own federal government Center for Disease Control study showed about 25,000 persons dying annually of firearm suicide, about 7.5 per 100,000 in the US, about 14,000 and about firearm homicide, just shy of half that number, about 4.2. So that more guns are used for suicide than homicide in the US is key. I think it's a take-home message for psychiatrists to point out to all of your patients, and whenever you're giving the informational settings like I'm giving today, to emphasize to persons, they may think they're buying a gun that'll be used to prevent a homicide. Many are aware, unfortunately, guns may be stolen and then used in the illicit market for an unfortunate felony-related homicide. But most likely, what happens with a gun that's bought by someone is someone else uses that gun to suicide. That's most commonly the circumstance. So issues regarding safety, regarding knowledge, practices that actually have the gun itself and the ammunition under lock and key by the owner, all probably best practices that we should consider. And each of these statistics helps us drive, I think, what should be our public policy at the state level, even the federal level, in my assessment, but clearly what we should share psychiatrists, I think, with our patients. A bit about Arizona. Again, thanks for having me. Speaking to our state psychiatric group there. Arizona, you should know, ranks in the top 20 states in the country in terms of firearm violence. In 2018, over 1,100 total deaths, and that firearm violence rate occurred at about 15 per 100,000. Here are the firearm-related deaths per 100,000 in the state of Arizona in 2018. As you can see, Arizona is higher than the overall national numbers in the U.S. Firearm-related deaths by sex, we note 2018, and there certainly are more by a large number in males than females. So we've known for a long time that firearm violence often is disproportionately a male gender-dominated phenomenon. And you see that carried out in Arizona as well as, I think, throughout the U.S. And by race. And you see differences. Largest peak among African Americans, I think the second peak among whites or Caucasians, and then smaller numbers in other demographic groups. But in each case, Arizona higher than the other national numbers. So that consistent pattern, I think, does continue. And I pointed out earlier that firearm-related suicides are higher in Arizona. So I think as a psychiatrist, the take-home message has to be that we talk to our patients about these risks. We emphasize that a person can certainly have a gun. That is their right, based on the Second Amendment. But I often will share that if we stop at that discussion, we're similar to the person who simply says, well, it's your right because you have high blood pressure, to eat a bad meal or choose not to exercise. This is our responsibility as psychiatrists and empirically based scientists in this area to know the data, be informed about it and educated, and then to share that hopefully in a proactive type fashion. Do I think that more individuals, once exposed to this accurate information, will be likely to alter or change or modify their behavior and thereby decrease societal risk? Absolutely. That's what we do in psychiatry. Very often, we engage in a risk management program on everything from behavioral discontrol to managing one's emotions and emotional volatility. Very often lead to other kinds of risk in driving and in taking risk in regards to the use of SUD or alcohol or drugs, or even use in interpersonal conflict. The same is true in regards to access to and our behavior around guns, which can lead to unwarranted and, in my estimation, very often unnecessary and preventable firearm deaths. The homicide numbers, again, similar to the suicide numbers, a bit higher in the state of Arizona per 100,000. We talk about gun violence in Arizona. Last year, 2019 data showed the total numbers, homicides, murders, just shy of 300. Total of injuries, mass shootings, there were 6. And we define a mass shooting now. Historically, it was a shooting where 4 or more people were shot, and mass murders, that many were died. Now they dropped it to 3 or more. And of course, the Gabby Gibbert's event in Arizona probably has been the red letter action or event that is often attributed to Arizona. As a sitting congresswoman, she was shot in a setting where she was at a mall and preparing to engage in some political activity. But we also see the number of children that are killed and injured there, number of teens in that setting, officer-involved shootings where LEOs or law enforcement officers have this concern. I've often pointed out that I think I have a later slide that will show that LEOs or law enforcement officers are at a high risk of dying, threefold high risk of dying, in settings where they're in a jurisdiction, a state with a high gun access or ability for laypersons to have a gun freely. So part of this data also emphasizes that as we think about safety and protection of society, we must also think, I think, as psychiatrists about safety and protection of our law enforcement officers who very often are at the front lines of these relevant degrees of risk. And our invite is emphasizing unintentional shootings or accidents. Also, those numbers are depicted. Where do the guns come from? And there's actually very good data indicating that often guns are produced in one location and then transported at times illegally to a different location. I'll point out in the next slide that the state in the country that is has the highest likelihood of producing guns is Virginia. And the city, I think, is near Richmond, Virginia. And this slide just shows how from the East Coast in that area, you see guns going north toward major urban areas, Philadelphia and New York City and Boston. You see guns going south toward southern Florida. You see guns going all the way to the west toward California, where I am today. So we definitely recognize that this is a national phenomenon and that the production of guns is not always consistent, or not even typically consistent, with where they actually are used. So very often guns are transported, sometimes legally, sometimes illegally, and very often they're used in a setting very disparate from where they're made, and by the same token, perhaps by someone who uses it for a different purpose than it was actually purchased. So this idea that there's what we call an iron pipeline is key. Therefore, restrictions in one state may often be circumvented by importing guns, again, legally or illegally, from a different state. So the supply of guns from the so-called secondary market we call the iron pipeline. New York, for example, is just great data that they have some of the most restrictive gun purchase laws, but many of the states in the South that produce guns are the guns that are trafficked to New York. I think it points out about 75%, about 3/4 of the ones in that setting end up going to New York, where there's a large tendency of individuals, a large number of patient population, but also a large number, I think, of gun-related accidents to death. So some would argue that laws don't prevent these bad things from happening, and this may be the reason, that the laws that prevent guns from being purchased in one setting are often disproportionately undermined by this illegal transport of this iron pipeline. Here's a slide that Virginia is the #1 supplier in this East Coast pipeline, but you actually tend to see this much more so really across, not just to New York, but across much of the country, as the earlier slide showed. Youth. I mentioned my objective section. We talk a bit about youth, and at times the numbers are surprising. I think we're all aware that similar to adults, there probably are more males than females involved in this setting with the use of firearms, youth and adult, but that we're seeing an increase in the use of guns by youth to settle conflict, either domestic at home with families and friends, or externally outside the home, you know, at schools and on their job or in their social engagements, I think is also key. And a huge issue for us to consider, because these problems start early and grow or worsen over time for many. Just one slide to point out that there are some groups really trying to argue that there's simply too much gun violence and trying to find ways to exert political pressure to limit access. That's one strategy. So education would be key, whether we're in schools or other settings. If you're talking about teens and young people, they still may be at a setting where you have access to them, separate them at work or at church or in their social engagements. But there's also the value of peer pressure that perhaps having more young persons, like in this picture, speak to others in their same peer age group. We may have better success in modifying or limiting the excessive use of guns that's growing in teen populations. Some of the data. Firearm violence results in over 1,000 deaths of children each year, and we're concerning children, you know, at or below age 12. Leading cause for firearms are homicide about half, suicide about 40%, and accidents about 5-6%. As stated earlier, with youth, like with adults, boys more likely to suffer fatal gunshot wounds, more purposeful, we would take from that. And the risk increases as you get to a teenage range of 15, 16, 17 years of age. Like I was in Louisiana, my first job in mid-90s, I finished training in Connecticut, and I was involved in some legal activity, political activity, where I was asked as a psychiatrist to testify about issues regarding firearms as Louisiana was debating and eventually passed what then was called Amendment 3, which would allow us a stronger level of prosecution against individuals who were less than age 17, even less than age 14, that historically wouldn't be charged as an adult if they used a firearm in the commission of a felony. Seeing that progression and more use of firearms in those settings has been disconcerting to many of us. Certainly myself, I've been involved in this now for a few decades, and trying to find strategies to limit the risk for use, I think is key. We point out they see differences between youth based on race and ethnicity. African Americans, about 10 times higher risk of homicide than Caucasians due to firearms. Caucasians, about 4 or 5 times higher risk of suicide than African Americans in this type setting, produced by Geronimo's. Some effects of youth access to guns. About 1,300 children die annually from firearm injuries. About half that number, about 5,700, suffering non-fatal gunshot wounds. Tragic, but still best that it's those are not fatal. About 1.7 million children live in households where there's actually a gun. And our studies have shown that often children know about the gun, even younger children, you know, less than age 13 or teenage age range. So it's not likely, based on the data that we have access to, that younger and younger persons do not know or are unaware that there's actually a gun in their home. Key issue. So it's a question I think to ask families when they speak about having a gun, or should they have a gun, or to make a flippant comment that they have a gun to protect themselves. One should ask, do you know if your children are aware that you have a gun, or where the gun is located? Could they find it? Is the ammunition next to the gun? Is the gun under lock and key? And have all persons in a home, whether they're the owner of the gun or not, been trained in safety maneuvers regarding guns to limit their risk of accidental shootings, fatal or non-fatal, and also the thought that perhaps they'll go to a gun first if there's a conflict in the home, very often domestic, rather than trying to use other non-violent related strategies or vectors to modify the ongoing conflict. The slide points out about 18 children dying a day due to guns. about 3/4 less than age 9, as I pointed out, knew the location of their parents' firearms, and about a third confessed they'd actually touched or handled the gun. And about 90% of accidental shootings occur in the home when children are left unattended. So just a volatile combination. I wrote a book about this. I think we'll show you at the end my book on firearm violence, and one of the seminal chapters, I think it's chapter 5 or 6, was written by a junior faculty who worked with me. I was chairman at Wake Forest School of Medicine, North Carolina, from 15 to 19. As I was writing this book, the book came out at 18, and one of the young faculty joined in the project and told his own personal story as a child psychiatrist of how he was, affected severely when, as a young person, his niece had actually accidentally shot his father, her biological grandfather. He grew up in home. He discusses growing up in Tennessee, where people, similar to my grandfather in Beaumont, Texas, already access to guns, and people are comfortable with them. They use them to hunt and protect themselves from animals. If you're out in a rural area, I'm sure the young child who was, less than age 10, as I recall, I think age 6, if I'm correct, probably had seen persons with guns and had a comfort level that may not have been commensurate with the level of risk. Came home one day and had access to the grandfather, was asleep, either on a couch or a bed or what have you, was probably playing with the gun, not thinking it would cause any harm, and actually accidentally shot and killed her grandfather in his sleep. So as tragic as that story is, and I realize that for all decisions, any one story is not, overly surmountable. But the reality is it does point out the essential need to find out what is known in your house if you have a gun. So you can have a gun, but make sure that proper safety measures are taken, I think is the key message, I think, from psychiatrists going forward. Takeaways are, many youth deaths are caused by simple gun presence in the household. People go to a gun when it's there and available. Very young children can access guns when they're unsupervised. I think that's really the worst overall degree of risk and should be mediated or eliminated. Non-advocacy groups, very often disagree with the interpretation of statistics. We point out that in 2015 at the U.S. Congress, the Speaker of the House of Representatives made the comment, quote, "I'm sorry, but a gun is not a disease," end quote. Whereas a psychiatrist, I would beg to differ. I think that today would argue that gun violence in our society, at the magnitude that the data supports, does present a public health crisis, as such a disease might. There are strategies that one could actually engage in to limit that risk, as a disease might. And very often when they're not used, the relative risk are higher in some areas than in others, as I would argue a disease might. All these concerns lead to the construct that we need optimized risk management. And very often we are the educators in this regard. We should educate society externally and globally, but individuals in our practice individually and more specifically. And I'll end with this comment that the AMA has been very actively lobbying Congress to overturn legislation that's actually blocked funding for firearm violence research. We often call it the Dickey Amendment. 1996, I think that was the year Congressman Arkansas Dickey really was the lead on pushing through legislation that has, unfortunately, indirectly decreased the energy and financial support at the federal government level for research in this area. We need more research, as we do in other areas where there's a public health crisis, and there are strategies that we need to understand best so we'll know how to educate, I think, our populace to limit risk, which I think has to be the key for our physician. Another item that I became very acutely aware of when I began involved in this work was we actually already have some technology that we just simply don't use that would make our society safer. We call them these firearms authorization systems, and they can implement a blocking mechanism. So you could have a biometric technology, for example, where a gun would be programmed. If I was to buy it, it was for me or at my house for safety, which is allowed under the Second Amendment, and we don't speak about infringing upon that. But if the gun was bought by me to protect me, I should be the one that should be able to use it. And a gun can be programmed where one's fingerprint or palm print or face recognition, like with a cell phone, could be the only way the gun would actually perform. One can imagine this might limit somebody else from playing with it and have an accidental shooting. Might prevent some bad guy from breaking into someone's home, stealing their gun, and then using it against them. It certainly might prevent someone from using the gun for untoward purposes. If the owner was the one who bought the gun under good intentions, protect his or her family or their own property or human capital, and would only use the gun after they've been trained with proper safety maneuvers in an appropriate way. So these kind of interventions, I think we should strongly support, and they can lead to many, not just you, being unable to access their parents' guns at home, for example, might curtail, as I stated earlier, accidental shootings. Here's an example of a token-based smart gun. A person has to have on a certain kind of a watch, or again, I mentioned a fingerprint, for the gun to actually be activated and actually to work. The use of this kind of technology has great utility. Unfortunately, this has very often been caught up in political battles and it's not really gone forward. Some also think that it's kind of high tech. They attribute it to, James Bond, for example. You see it on a movie. And although it sounds, again, very high tech, if it were to be implemented, I think, across the board nationally, we would more likely see, I think, from a risk management perspective, a decrease or diminution in unwarranted shootings or deaths due to firearms. A bit about the Dickey Amendment. I think I mentioned earlier that law enforcement officers are 3 times more likely to be murdered by guns in areas where there's high gun ownership. And it also points out that I think our patients, those who have the most serious and persistent mental illness with diagnoses like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and SAD, should necessarily just be blamed. Our patients, I think, has been well discussed, and I like to point out when I give my lectures, are more likely to be victims of high-end dynamic violence than perpetrators of such. Now, if you ask, are the chronically mentally ill more likely to be arrested for crimes? The answer is yes, but by a small amount. Maybe 4 or 5% more likely arrested for crimes, but very often petty nonviolent crimes, trespassing and damaging somebody's flowers or property out front in a confused, disoriented kind of way. But probably by about 35 or 40%, individuals who are more likely to use a gun to hurt someone fall into 3 categories. One, the persons who have alcohol or drugs in the system. Secondly, there's a person who's been a victim of prior violence, are more likely to use a gun going forward. And third, those who've been a prior user or perpetuator of gun violence. Those are 3 groups. Those who've used a gun to hurt people in the past, those who've been hurt by a gun, and those who have been a victim of violence, firearm violence, and those who have a SUD or a substance use disorder. Interesting, I always comment that all 50 states have laws prohibiting and modifying and limiting the use of guns if they think that you have some mental illness, if you've been civilly committed, for example. That's the underpinning often of the discussion that they are going to come take your guns from you. That they very often speaks about us. We're psychiatrists who often will civilly commit someone, and very often that leads to a judge being able to say this person cannot have guns going forward. We think we're doing that in a positive way, in an effective way for that individual in society to limit the likelihood of hurting themselves or somebody else with a gun. I think very often that's been misconstrued politically, unfortunately for some, for political purposes. But the reality is none of the states, of all 50 states, have laws that prohibit you from having a gun based on the dynamic empirical data that if you have a history of alcoholism or drug use, by definition, those are the ones who, with that history, but without necessarily a violent felony-based history, you should be the one who should be limited, those individuals, from actually having access to guns. It may seem a bit, controversial to some, but not really to me. We generally make laws based on scientific data that addresses relevant degrees of risk. And I think that's actually the same case, I think, in this setting, kind of going forward. So the Dickey Amendment was reported out, barred the CDC from awarding grants to persons who are going to do research on trends in gun violence and gun prevention. I think it's actually hurt us. I mean, we've had a couple of decades now. We probably would have more quality work in this area if it could have been funded. A lot of that, many would have probably scared away many young researchers who would have wanted to create a career doing work in this area. So often when we have this debate in non-academic settings, we're yelling at one another and we're arguing, I think, about apples and oranges and not discussing the data that I think is levels the playing field that we can then use in a proactive way going forward. So we point out, again, simply the presence of firearms in the home is strongly associated with a high risk of homicide, very often of your own family member. So as the point made earlier, I reemphasize that when persons buy a gun, it would be optimal if they were aware, let alone told, that they should be very cautious and careful that that gun doesn't end up being used as so many other guns are used to hurt or harm one of their own blood relatives in their own home in some kind of an accidental, confusing circumstance that people could not predict. And that's often when these situations tend to occur. Again, increasing rates of suicide and homicide in states with high gun access, increased rates of unintentional accidental death when they're high gun access. So the leader of a non-advocacy group pointed out a comment that gained a lot of national attention, some pro and some con, but it does lead to a discussion about where many Americans are on this issue. And I think it's worth, our attention. The comment was, and remains, the only thing that helps stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Some would argue that in every school in the country, we should have an armed police officer, because some bad person may come in and try to hurt individuals. Someone said if the school is very large, you should have two, one on one end and one on the other end, because there's higher risk or higher rates. It's very clear that these issues are politically charged, and there are pros and cons to each argument. But the simple idea that the way to decrease firearm violence is by having more people have guns is just not based on any data. It would seem much more likely that the more persons who have guns, the more individuals who we cannot control, or we don't know if there's some limitation in their thinking or their construct of how to use the gun or when to use the gun or keep. And we don't have to look at, I think, a variety of these adverse circumstances. You know, one is the individual who was in the city of Las Vegas, and he went to a hotel room and shot through the window, very high-powered weaponry with high magazine capacity weapons that could shoot, not just tens, but hundreds of bullets, every, short period of time, seconds or minutes, what have you. And I think he hit 500 people and killed 50. And nobody really thought about that. So to me, similar to the 9/11 event, where individuals flew airplanes in the buildings, and we hadn't thought in the past about persons hijacking planes, but being willing to kill themselves in the process. Historically, folks would hijack a plane and fly away someplace and want to get off and maintain their personal safety and then get their liberty. So it just kind of points out that we've got to appreciate that, with high access, persons who may be thinking differently and have figured out some strategies that we haven't really thought to think to prevent until they happen, put individuals at risk. Before the issue in Las Vegas happened, few would have thought that somebody would have gone into a hotel room and shot through the window in order to shoot hundreds of people down in the public area. But by the same token, many would not have thought before the Sandy Hook case in New England, Connecticut, I think it was, that anyone would walk into a school and shoot dead 26-year-olds who are in the first grade, who by definition not only are not posing any risk, there can't be any dynamic conflict with them, they also in general, one wouldn't think, create any political challenge. Some persons are likely to be shot. They're a national leader, for example, in attempts at, coup d'etats in countries all around the country, all around the world. So the idea is you're going to go after someone who may represent some political issue that you disagree with, but not 6-year-old children. So I just point out those two examples, and there are a myriad of them, just to emphasize that we probably can't think we're safe and protected because we know what persons are going to do. I think that the human brain is a changing construct, and it's very dynamic. And just like the things that happened in the past that we didn't know and prepared for them, we've really ramped up our defenses now. In the airport you go to, there's a TSA line. There's a longer line because we're checking everyone for all the kind of box cutters and metal objects that we found on persons who hijacked the planes in 911. But there's some other strategies we probably are not aware of yet that someone may have as an intentionality going forward. I don't say that to make our members of our Arizona Psychiatric Society afraid or for you to show your patients to be afraid, but just to say that if we're going to be true scientists in this regard of these public health measures, they should be pretty broad-based to recognize that we have to be mindful of providing some limitation of risk of circumstances that have not yet occurred as we try to prepare for them. I think this point has been made. The increase in number of firearm ownership in this last 15-year period, so the number of firearms have grown up. We actually have now more firearms, about 350 million than people, about 330 million in America. This increase also has led to other risks I mentioned earlier for law enforcement. Some of the key points, I think, for LEOs or law enforcement officers, where their homicide rates are higher. You see a fair amount of this in some southern states and some out west in places that have a high gun ownership. That's, I think, about 15-year data from the late 90s to about 2010. Similar rates in the next slide, just pointing out where these increases occur and that they're higher again among law enforcement persons. And I think we're seeing a lot more risk in our contemporary society now in 2020 with the civil unrest and a lot of conflicts that are occurring. It's very clear that we're struggling as a society to get our hands around what we might be able to do to provide some prevention and safety for all. That has to, in many regards, begin with law enforcement, because again, they experience such a high degree of risk. I was so struck by in the 911 circumstance, I give this example again, when the destruction of the World Trade Towers, how police and fire persons, men and women, run toward the conflict. And rightly so, everybody else tries to get away. So they are a very different group in America, and a group that I think we must have a higher tendency or propensity toward considering what it takes to kind of maintain their safety. Conversely, about 1 in 25 people are killed by guns or killed by police. About 4% of all firearm deaths, 539 in this work by the Center for Disease Control. About 60% or 3 out of 5 victims of police shootings were carrying guns at the time of their death. So it points out that about 40% of the time they were not. And 40% of 539 is a pretty large number. So that to me kind of speaks of the idea that with the hyper ramped up hypervigilance around guns, around firearm violence in our society, we see a lot of it in the media. There's a discussion regularly about wherever you live, if there was a gun shooting or killing of late, if the numbers are growing over the course of the last year in your jurisdiction. These things are concerning to all of us. And even our law enforcement officers hear and read and understand these numbers as well. So I think our role has to be somehow to throw water, not lighter fluid, on the fire of firearm violence in America. We've got to educate and inform persons at every step along the way to limit these risks and to modify the behaviors. It may sound a little, touchy-feely to some, but I think there's a lot of value in trying to strengthen strategies for individuals to find ways to talk through their problems and find other strategies to de-escalate rather than moving so quickly toward the use of a fatal ending for themselves or somebody else with a gun. I think the point here where about 60% of police shootings where the victim didn't have a gun at all, and about a fourth by family members as having SPMI. So I think I mentioned earlier, if you have a chronic mental illness, you're much more likely to be a victim of violent crime, even when it's accidental or uncertain, than a perpetrator of such crime. Other reasons for more community-based training of police and law enforcement in this setting. The classic issue of a person with mental illness, severe depression, for example, or psychotic illness, incarcerated or jailed for their actions. Again, very often nonviolent inside starts that can lead down, I think, an unfortunate constellation events that might lead to violent actions. Perception, I think, in our patients is so unfortunate that very often the media may make much more dramatic than it should be, and distort the images of the risk of our patients. And the final point to emphasize is that the consequences of this limits the self-esteem and behavior. We go and seek care, seek treatment. Many people are afraid or embarrassed because of stigma, so they don't go for care, and that limits them ever getting full recovery. Even when they start getting better, it's a bit spotty. So the vast majority of SPMI patients are not prone to violence, are more likely to be victims of violence than compared to the general population. Our patients, though, are much more likely to be incarcerated. 1 in 4 of these shootings of law enforcement officers are an individual with SPMI. Very often these situations become highly volatile, poor communication, a lot of high volume, yelling and screaming, and disparate behavior. There's a recent one we just saw on television here not too long ago where the individual was walking away from the police and they weren't sure, where he was going. And I'm not sure if he understood them or heard what they were speaking of. The entire situation looked very confusing, but didn't really start off with violence toward the police, but then with the person actually being harmed or killed. So we've got to find ways to interject some rationality and some common sense into these events to try to limit just this rampant excess of firearm violence in these settings. Final point, almost all states, 44, 45 states, where a prison or a jail holds more patients with SPMI than the largest state hospital. I'm somebody that ran a state hospital early in my career. I got the job as the medical director of the Bryce State Psychiatric Hospital outside of Birmingham, really Tuscaloosa, Alabama in 2004, about a decade and a half ago. And that's what we saw. We saw a hospital with 60% of the 400 patients there were forensic patients, and there was something forensic oriented. They had some kind of a legal charge for criminal activity or what have you. Many have been victims of crime, sometimes violent crime, although historically, those 400 beds have been used for persons with truly SPMI who are long-term state hospital patients. So we're flipping our state hospitals into forensic-based settings. It's been going on now for a couple of decades, not really new. I think 96 or 98 was the year we actually flipped from having more patients getting, as we decreased hospital beds, getting care in other settings rather than inpatient than those who are in a typical inpatient psychiatric hospital. And one of the places where they go now is being incarcerated in a DOC setting versus inpatient psych hospital in a DMH. One main point with this next slide that in 2020, we estimate that about half of the mass shootings that are associated will occur. There'll be an associated person with SPMI. So again, the confusion, lack of coordination of activities or events, and poor communication often worsens these settings, increases the likelihood, I think, of mass shootings. In fact, the third bullet points out that the patients are generally not prone to violence in general population unless they're SUD. I mentioned earlier the three key issues that make somebody a lot more likely to be involved in these problems are SUD, a substance use disorder, 2, being a victim of violent crime in the past, and 3, being a perpetrator of violent crime. Those are the three groups that are a lot more likely to use a gun in a commission of a homicide. SUD, very involved in gun violence. I think it's just a volatile combination, but it just does not mix. I think we all know that alcohol tends to make persons more impulsive, less likely to find ways, other strategies to, to de-emphasize, I think, the hostility or latent hostility that may occur. Also a lot more likely to say the wrong thing or say it with a lot more hot sauce on it, quote unquote, I'll argue. And these are all concerns that I think fuel the engine of firearm violence. We note that most adults over age 50 have, or over age 18, excuse me, drink alcohol, and firearms are available in about a third of U.S. households. And if alcohol reduces the awareness of danger and heightens aggressive behaviors, then you're going to, with that combination, increase the risk of gun violence when you combine access to guns, not even guns that are safety-oriented, such as use of biotechnology, not having a person who's used safety maneuvers up front, and then having alcohol use. Final point, whether it's intentional or otherwise, gun-related harm to self and others is just very frequently associated with alcohol consumption, what I think are key take-home points. One item here by Charles pointed out this 30-year meta-analysis of 18 cases of unintentional gun injury, homicide and suicide, showed that about 40% of the time, homicide victims had drank alcohol, and about 30% of those had drank heavily, before death. So you have drank, you had 4 beers or 2 drinks, or a glass of wine, or 1 heavy drink, and heavy drinking, maybe even more than that. So that study kind of assessed the ability to use firearms after alcohol consumption, and it found that alcohol consumption, as you might imagine, lowered the reaction time in a scenario that didn't require judgment, and increased the reaction time when there was complex decision-making involved. So in each case along the way, when there's alcohol or drug use involved, it heightens the risk of death or mortality when firearms are mixed in that as an interplay. As I pointed out earlier, currently no federal laws preventing individuals with an alcohol use disorder from gun ownership. And only really 18 states restrict gun ownership at all if you have habitual alcohol use. And my final point, insufficient studies on alcohol use in gun victims, getting back to the Dickey Amendment, could go a long way to helping us kind of address this concern on the problem. This is a slide showing that I think there's a lot of discussion about the Second Amendment, but really what's happened is that there's been a flow of guns well beyond the Second Amendment. Second Amendment probably implied persons could have a gun to protect themselves and hunt and fish and those type things. The persons will go in and buy just a plethora of guns at a gun show. So the flow, the volume, the magnitude, more guns to people. That part is really much more substantive than it really should be. So I'll conclude, I think, in the last 6 or 7 minutes here. Firearm violence is, by definition, a public health crisis. We discussed this a lot in the APA over a few decades, but in 2016, again, the AMA made that point, bringing a lot, I think, of political punch, I think, on our side of the equation to address this, I think, as a medical healthcare problem. It's a universal issue, not just confined to any single group based on gender or ethnicity or history of mental illness or his class. Whereas we see these problems in all groups across all areas of specification. Next, those ravaged by firearm violence are not just the primary victims of the guns, but also the secondary, tertiary victims. We think about, I mentioned the case in Sandy Hook earlier, where the entire city was viewed as having PTSD after 20 little children were killed. Many persons in that community were remarkably affected, whether those are their kids or not. And finally, the issue wants change, I think, in cultural attitudes, followed by legislative reform, before we can progress the nation into a scenario where we're really free of unnecessary firearm violence. So thank you for your time. Really appreciate the opportunity to speak for the first time before the Arizona State Psychiatric Society. I wish you guys very well. Terry Harnish, your coordinator, has been just an excellent participant, I think, in our APA processes. I think I mentioned earlier that I was a national chairman of membership for an APA from 14 to 18. She was one of two coordinators of local societies, district branches, to be on our committee. She did a great job for us then. I thank your president for inviting me as well. Ron Bailey, have a good day.
Dr. Bailey, I see we have our video from you now, and thank you for the very kind words. It was such a pleasure to serve with you and have you as chair of the membership committee. You do a phenomenal job for the APA, and it's absolutely a pleasure.
Oh, thanks very much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I think that when we're working with members, we're doing good work in the APA, district branches and national. So this is actually a good program.
I think Dr. Fowles, did you have a few comments to offer?
Well, it was a remarkable presentation, really well done, excellent information. And, the presentation of facts, it's always good to be facts-based as opposed to anything else. And also just very thoughtful and, informed commentary as well. Because this is a, potentially volatile issue with different points of view, perspectives on it and everything. But, I think you really presented it well in a very sound and intelligent way, and so definitely appreciate it. So I'd really like to open up for Q&A here too for Dr. Bailey.
Thank you, Dr. Fowles. I've had a question here waiting for a while from Dr. Boyle, who says, I recently had a patient bring a gun, not sure if it was accidentally or not, into his Suboxone follow-up appointment. He didn't do anything threatening, but must admit it scared me. So do no guns permitted here signs help? Can you speak to the interaction, if any, between these two public health topics, guns and opioids?
Absolutely. I, like you, would be afraid if somebody came in with a gun. I've been fortunate throughout most of my career. I've worked in mental health centers, and we all work in hospitals that increasingly now have ramped up their security. And there's a metal detector you walk in, like where I work now. I got here about 15 months ago, and I made the move to put one at the back door as well as the front door. This is an example. They had one at the front door, so whenever patients or family walked in, they had to walk in through that door. But employees park in the back in the employee lot and walk in the back door. There was really no metal detector. But much of the data argues, I wrote a paper years ago on the 8 phases of workplace violence. People typically call it going postal. Those are settings that very often create some degree of risk. Now we have live security 24/7 with a metal detector, both the front door and the back door, which really to me is the example that extrapolates the issue that I think we all are employees of wherever we work. And of course, we deserve to be safe as well, all of us and all of our patients and staff. But it also points out perhaps that patients are part of society. Many society actually have guns now. The entire lecture spoke about the sheer volume of access to weapons. Again, more weapons than, more guns than people in America. So the fact that somebody might actually have one, incidentally, is also possible. But then a conflict can occur when they incidentally had a gun on them. Once a conflict occurs, they very easily access the weapon to resolve the conflict. And that's what very often leads to this heightened risk of mortality. I think the third and final point I'll make is the flip side could be that a person intentionally brings a gun for a session with their physician either because they're feeling vulnerable for some reason, or they want to make others feel weak or at risk. All adverse options and considerations that we should be mindful of and kind of think through in advance. I guess to answer the particular question, I'd hope that a no guns allowed policy with signage would be useful, helpful. I think perhaps one probably does need more as best we can. And I know the reality of being in a private office in a private building, it's near impossible to just on one's own have a sign up that or have a metal detector. So there's just some impracticalities in much of this now that makes it, that it elevates the risk, which again speaks to the reality of educating persons about guns and gun access and really decreasing the overall volume. That's a classic example of how decreased volume of access to guns would be helpful.
So Dr. Bailey, I have a couple of other questions. The one in the chat from Dr. Watson is, I work in a rural area where gun ownership in families, I question, I'm sorry, where families own guns is a cultural norm. Can you give any recommendations about what to do to talk with families and to minimize the availability of guns to children?
Yes, I strongly believe that, I think I talked today a little bit about what I call a three-pronged approach. One, we shouldn't be afraid to broach the topic. We're the scientists, we're the experts. This is our sweet spot, our area of professional interest and knowledge. I thank you, President Foss, for comments regarding how difficult it can be because there often are very strongly polarized opinions on both sides of this issue. But we probably should professionally encourage, and I hate to use the word force, but really push the issue and have somewhat of an open discussion. It's in part because, as I said earlier, often persons are just operating with inadequate information, and hopefully we can provide correct information and move away from just the sound bites. The other thing, though, I think that's also key is, yes, indeed, there are going to be these risks and where people that have access to guns and how they actually engage and interact. But I think we have an opportunity, perhaps, once we develop a therapeutic alliance, with the patient, to maybe get to have them hear us in a way differently than what they hear in a normal mainstream medium or in settings that are less academic, when they're at home or in the movie or in social settings with friends or the family union, what have you. Maybe we hope that they will hear you as their physician, their psychiatrist, differently. And of course, we always hope that, one of our goals is to be able to change behavior in an ongoing and a positive and a progressive way by promoting safety. It's tricky, though. At times, persons may put up an initial barrier to discussion and want to end it quickly. But I encourage all of us to be, pretty diligent in our approach, patient, if you will. This may require a second and a third bite at the apple to kind of get the point across. It's all too often unfortunate that until there's a bad outcome, a mass murder or a really big event, that many persons are kind of becoming desensitized to the issues regarding gun violence. And that's a bad thing. We should be hypersensitized. Therefore, we perhaps will move the needle and move toward an effort of changing the behavior of all Americans toward limiting unnecessary gun violence.
So a couple more questions. Dr. Eric Benjamin asks, why do you think LEOs don't lead in advocating for better gun laws given the increased risk to them and societies rather than sometimes aligning with the NRA platforms or politicians? It seems that they could be a powerful group to affect change. Are these educational presentations given to them?
All excellent points, and I'll briefly just state I'd agree on all 4 points that you made. One, I don't have any idea why law enforcement officers don't tend to hear this message. A lot of data that I pointed out today, that they tend to be at a higher risk when many members of society actually have guns or have weapons. Second, I think a second point is when you begin to talk about guns and how people consider them, this idea that a person feels more powerful, empowered, whether they use a gun or not, just by having a gun on their presence or close to them. A person can walk into a mall or a movie theater or a store, but if they have a gun in their car, in a glove box, if they get into a verbal conflict with someone in a restaurant or in the mall or in the store, they engage in very often, the data would argue, a more aggressive type fashion probably because they think that if this escalates, I can walk out to my car and get my gun. So that moves away from what we said earlier. We want persons to, we're psychiatrists, we want them to mediate and modify and minimize their behavior verbally and with language and use so-called de-escalation techniques. I think the third issue is that I always wonder, unfortunately, to what degree, fiscal matters, money, finances come into play. We all are very much aware that many law enforcement settings receive a fairly substantial amount, I think, of financing from the federal government to become more militarized. So there's a ramping up of the need and access of not only weapons in general, but high impact, high magazine, highly powerful weapons. So if the outside entities want to get bullets that can pierce the bulletproof protector that law enforcement wears, then they want to have a more powerful weapon as well. So I think the whole discourse, in my estimation, is remarkably upside down. It should be in the other direction, rather than trying to make sure we are out-arming the other side that are potentially in conflict with us. And my final point, I would absolutely agree. We just have to continue to be repetitive in our messaging and get this point across to law enforcement, federally and statewide and local, that law enforcement should be a peacekeeping force. They shouldn't show up ready to engage in, hand-to-hand conduct and battle. They should have access to all strategies possible to de-escalate and modify conflict without it ending with anybody dying, without it ending in, a physically violent, let alone a gun-oriented type conflict or concern. I tend to think that the issue that law enforcement has not been involved in making this point, as I think you point out very astutely, is a remarkably missed opportunity. And many of us are going to spend a fair amount of our career trying to move that needle and to change that concern. The final point I'll make is that periodically throughout my life, I've worked in university departments of psychiatry that had contracts with local law enforcement to conduct the initial assessment, whether someone had the mental stability, theoretically, and wherewithal to even enter the police academy, let alone finish it and become a policeman. And I, like many others, have unfortunately been, surprised. Some would argue at times even bordering on being shocked at some of the mindset of individuals who are going out for the police department. Much more militaristic, much more offensive-minded, much more, ready to actively engage in, hostility-laden conflict that may lead to violence and death, rather than thinking more along the line of how we all grew up watching television, and Gomer Pyle and Andy Griffith and those persons were police officers who were part of the community and friendly and engaging and there to find ways to help modify things. But we all thought that they had the image, at least, was that they had the capacity, if needed, in a last case scenario, to end a violent conflict, because they probably had a gun on their person in a society of persons who may not be able to do so. If you're a regular society member, you go to the mall, you don't expect that you're going to have a gun to protect yourself. But they should use all those strategies in advance to limit it. So again, the needle has been moved too much in the pro-aggressive mindset for law enforcement, and we all have to kind of work together, I think, to change it.
So I'm going to jump a little bit out of order, Dr. Bailey, because I see a question that's really kind of dovetails very well for where you just talked. Dr. Kent Klena asks, how would you recommend dealing with a patient who is a police officer who brings their gun to their session?
Well, again, I think that, your session is and should be yours to control the ins and outs, just like you might have a family member who may bring relative into a session with them, and you may determine that relative may be potentially creating more harm to that family member, to that patient than otherwise. You may ask the family member to step outside so you can speak specifically and individually with that family member, especially in a case where maybe it's a person, maybe a woman that you might have a inkling that is being physically abused, or a child, for example. By the same token, I think that it's very reasonable to ask someone not to come into your office, with a weapon. Not only I think there's maybe put you at risk and may make you feel somewhat afraid of the circumstance at times, and rightly so. At times, the discussion between a patient and a psychiatrist can become heated or conflictual when challenging topics are being discussed. No one wants to, in that setting, potentially have a volatile circumstance escalate out of control. The other thing, though, I think is that you really want in therapy and in a doctor-patient setting to develop a relationship that's based on some degree of fairness and balance. And that's off balance when someone acts as a weapon and you know they have a weapon and they know you have it. If it's done accidentally, that's not optimal. If it's intentional, it's even worse because it certainly creates an imbalance of power in what should be a verbal exchange of ideas. And when you factor in that emotions may be somewhat up and down, seesaw in that setting as well, it's just not good for there to be some degree of risk that one can't control. So I think one can certainly ask as a treating clinician, physician, that a person, patient not come into your office, with a weapon.
I have a two-part question from Dr. Chatwal. Thank you first for the wonderful presentation, Ron. And I have a two-part question. Would reducing availability of assault weapons for the regular public be an effective approach to reduce gun violence? My personal guess is yes. And if that is the case, what are some of the most effective steps professional organizations as ours can take?
Well, as my lecture stated, I tend to believe that the data is very clear, as I interpret it, that a sheer high volume of weapons and a higher volume of high impact weapons is adverse in the circumstances we want to decrease gun violence in America. So the answer would be yes. I think that a decrease would be beneficial. There's probably four things I consider. One, I think that we probably shouldn't make it so easy to simply buy a gun in any place. And the classic issue is you could have all kind of rules and laws in some places. That probably is number one. And number two, though, is one way to skirt around the rules is to have a gun show. A person kind of go and buy, dozens of guns in one day that you couldn't if you had to kind of register. That probably is number two. I think number three, though, we were also learning, and again, very often many of us are kind of behind the game. I've probably been behind this game, that you can actually buy a regular weapon. I'll use that term kind of loosely, and buy some other aspects or components or tools or strategies that can elevate that gun into more of a high impact weapon. I think it's called bump, and I forget the name of the technology, but you can click buy this piece, add it to a regular weapon, the weapon becomes one that isn't just a single shooter, for example, but a multiple, distributor of high impact weapons, i.e. like a machine gun. Limiting those kinds of access to those kinds of tools or strategies to make weapons more harmful and more volatile and more vicious, in my opinion, I think are moves in the right direction. Final point, I think that organizations like ours have to, talk about these issues. So I, again, commend your president, your program committee for having this topic on the discussion. We should probably speak about it pretty regularly. Like in psychiatry, we speak about suicide every year in every venue and every setting. It's regularly, right in our sweet spot, again, I'll say, of the key things that I think are important to us. And if the health and safety and well-being of our society has to be our responsibility, like other medical organizations, this will remain, I think, one of our priorities.
So Dr. Bailey, as we're approaching the hour, I have one last question, and then I thought, before you do closing remarks, shall we run that post-test and as a poll and see if people's informed, or I think you had a pretty informed group in the beginning. I know you jumped on from a Board of Trustees meeting, but the answers looked pretty informed. I'll be sure to share the pre-results. But the last question from Dr. Gary Grove is, how much of the inability to stop the trends in increasing firearm violence is due to the lack of data, and how much is due to political will?
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for assistance with the pre and post test. I think I mentioned at the very beginning, we've been doing this now since January of 17. My goal is to do it until I get 1,000 in on these exact type of lecture series when we do the pre and the post test. And happy to hear that we have a very informed audience. I found audiences that I've given this lecture remarkably varied, because they have not all been audiences solely of physicians, and also of groups like all psychiatrists. I found physicians probably more advanced in this regard in general, and the psychiatrists more advanced than the non-psychiatric physicians. So that's actually also good to hear. I think that clearly answer the question. There are probably some things that we can do, and we probably should do, I think, kind of going forward. It's our responsibility. We mentioned about education and what have you. But I also think that, it's going to be up to us to, as we teach and educate persons kind of going forward in school and in training and whether it's in fellowship, we make these issues, I think, not only a priority, but find ways to link them, I think, to the key issues that have caused problems. The so-called Dickey Amendment, that has been considered to be the, primary tool or strategy used in government to limit funding for research in this area has, many argue, had a marked effect on decreasing what we've done. I spent 2 years writing the book that I spoke about to you today. And in most settings, so much of data comes from CDC-funded data, through research, but increasingly there's less of it than it would be because over so many years we've actually limited persons getting this research. So a lot of it now comes from, private sources and even international sources. The point that I thought I'd like to make is this is a challenge to organized medicine and to science. If someone can decide that politically they don't want a certain answer, so they're not going to fund the data-driven, empirical data-driven opportunity, whatever later someone decided arbitrarily they don't want to know that you shouldn't eat, high-calorie foods to increase your risk of diabetes, because somehow in the long run it kind of helped them politically or helped them financially in the business that they had. That's not really what the kind of society we want to live in. I think we engage in, the null hypothesis. Can you disprove that this would have happened otherwise or just by chance? And that's what science revolves around, the idea that there's going to be an unbiased, ethically based process to determine whether the way we act is empirically driven and based on fact, and facts that can be replicated in different settings by different researchers. That's the reason why we all go to science. So I'm very challenged, and I love the question, I'm very challenged by this potential construct that politics will be so demanding now that they actually push us away from a science-based approach. And that's true whether you're talking about gun violence or eating high-calorie foods and the risk of endocrinopathy like diabetes or other types of medical concerns. So I think we all have a very vested interest in being active and articulate and pretty diligent in our approach to really push against that, not only in regards to gun violence, but in regards to other forms of healthcare or public health concerns. We should speak against the Dickey Amendment and other challenges to just conducting research that may or may not show an answer that a politician or a political group would want to hear.
Okay, well, let's poll that audience. I'm gonna start us on the post-test.
Good.
There we go. Dr. Bailey, in presentation mode, I'm not sure you'll see the pop-up, but our attendees do.
Okay.
So while they're doing that, those were, Dr. Bailey, I really appreciate your time and thoughtfulness in answering the questions. And again, a really, area that has multiple perspectives and groups around it. And I think you really kind of pierced through all that and gave us the facts and a really good perspective. So we really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. It's an issue that keeps growing.
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately, right.
So, and Dr. Bailey, I know I'm not sure that you're somewhere you could see the chat, but while we're giving people a couple minutes, since I don't have another question to share with you, hello from Dr. Dawn, who said she served in training with you at UT, and nice to see you, and thanks for a very informative presentation.
Hello back to I actually can see it now. Absolutely. Some
okay,
great.
There we go.
Good, very good.
And please go ahead, Dr. Bailey.
I also thought earlier one about parents and their kids, and how can parents speak to kids with the presence of guns in the home. And I know I'd spoken the prepared comments about the colleague of mine and his niece and the unfortunate shooting of his father, her grandfather. Can't emphasize enough just how essential it is to talk to and educate kids about guns when guns are in the house. When they're not in the house, your kid may go over to visit somebody else's home, and that place may be one that families are more comfortable having guns if there are none in your home, and kids still need to hear about these items and understand the issues about safety. So it's just part of the society we live in, just like we should all wear a seatbelt when we're in a car, whether we're driving or not, or whether we think we're a safe driver or not. Somebody else may hit you or bump you, and that could be a problem. So the reality is this is an issue, I think, of safety, all Americans, and we should certainly speak about it pretty clearly. So I like the question. I hope I also mentioned earlier, it's probably something you should lead with in treating your patients, because it's the type of thing that may actually not be openly brought up by others, but if you're thinking about it, like many other, clandestine issues when you go into therapy. But it's also one in which I think there's so much, unfortunate, in my opinion, political, speaking of politics, propaganda, that some become reluctant to broach the issue because they think that they're going to, be challenged or have their, head kind of bitten off, because in so many other settings of their life, these are hard things to talk about, because persons want to have what I call the, 30-second conversation, and just, both sides kind of retreat to their corners and make a quick argument, on one single vector. I'm for it or against it for this reason or that reason, and I don't want to hear anything else. The simple fact that we've been on, an hour here and had a long conversation, this is probably not something everybody will do, but definitely more than just, that one initial response based on emotion and fright, and not supported by data or evidence to hopefully try to change a mood behavior. We always hope that if we do that with children and young persons earlier and earlier in their life, they'll be more comfortable having a conversation that does challenge some of the preconceptions that may not be based on fact.
Okay, I'm going to share those post-test results. Dr. Bailey, can you see them, or shall I read how
I can.
And how did we do?
Yeah, elevated gun presence, increased death rates. The AMA classified firearm violence as a public health crisis in 2016. In Arizona, the firearm homicide rate occurs. It notes that I think 32.68% got the number per 100,000. How many children die?
I think the statistical questions were a little bit more split on the statistical questions. So what were the right answers on 4 and 5? Yeah,
for the children that die from firearm annually, that number 1,300 was the right answer. Choose from the following options for firearm injuries. And in 2018, what percentage, number 5, of firearm violence deaths were contributed to by police? And I think that was 12%. So I think we got about 49%. We got number 5 correct, and about 55% got number 4 correct. Just about everybody was correct on a couple of the others. Well, about 68%, I think, on 3, and almost everybody on the AMA question and on the elevated gun violence question. So I think you're right. I think you have had a pretty informed audience pre and post, and that's actually good to see.
So I want to thank you again, Dr. Bailey. Dr. Fowles, any closing remarks before we tell everyone to enjoy a lunch break?
Yeah, no, thanks again, Dr. Bailey. Really appreciate it, and don't want to get in the way of lunch here,
Sounds good.
So, all right. So, well, yeah, very good. So we'll see you all at 12:30 here for Dr. Setter. So thanks again.
Yeah, thanks, and have a good day.
Thank you, Dr. Bailey.
Bye-bye, Terry.